So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming, braving the rain if you're here in DC. So I think we are having a series of events, lots of different themes that get inside the black box of the classroom, and none more important than what we're about to hear this afternoon. So I just want to say that we're, very glad to be seeing this work go forward and hearing from Julia and Ezekiel. So we are going to hear about 20, 25 minutes presentation, or how much did you have planned? 30 minutes, okay. And then we'll have some comments from Kidwai and Julia. Over to you.
Thank you.
I'll start the first one for the when it becomes more difficult, Julia will do it for me. So I wanted to tell a little bit about this project before I started. So the first thing I want to say is also we are presenting, but Noah was also part of the team working on this. So if you are hearing this, Noah, good. If not, I don't know, because in Indonesia, I don't know whether he will be on. But we started this project in January with Julia, that has been working really a lot on this, and this is part of a bigger project within our team to try to measure classroom practices and teacher practices, and we're doing some work with Dion on checking what is the best way you can measure these things in the classroom, and whether you can do low inference, high inference, and what is the best way that you can convey this information. As well as we are developing a classroom observation tool in Geek called Teach, for which I will talk at some point during the presentation. But this is not about Teach. This is about what countries do measure. And I think we started this research because we wanted to answer this simple question on, do countries systematically measure what happened in the classroom? And though that seems like a pretty obvious question, we find out that many people didn't know. And when we start talking to country teams, they may measure and they may have a tool, but they're not using it anymore. And and even if you have a tool, how do you use that tool? And whether those tools are accurate and reliable, was not really clear for us. And I think this is the first attempt to try to put all that together. And of course, it will not be the last, because there's a lot of gap in terms of information about what's going on in these countries, and whether even if they have a tool, how they actually use it. So, as I said, the objective is to try to understand what information countries use systematically to collect. They do collect on classroom practices, and the question is why this is important. No, at the end of the day, even if they don't measure, why we should care about measuring or not what happened in the classroom. And I think, I don't have to say much about the learning crisis, because we all know, Dion and Halsey are here, so you can, and Summer as well, you can read the report on the WDR. And I think that we know from the WDR, as well as other pieces of research, that one big proximate cause of the learning crisis is what teachers know and do. So the fact that teachers do have low abilities, especially in the countries that we are, that we care about. In a study that we did in Africa, we find that a quarter of teachers could actually answer an exam that was done for fourth graders correctly. And that means that there was a lot of content knowledge gap in their understanding, but not also that. Even when they were in the classroom, they were like the teaching practices that they would perform where only 1 in 10 teachers would do teacher practices that we would think that we know by the literature are those that promote student learning. So there is a bit of evidence that there is poor learning in these schools where it's also it's poor student learning, and this is poor teaching, not while learning, sorry. And and one thing that that the WDR come out, saying is like, we do have a lot of training programs to improve what teachers know and what teachers do in the classroom, but there is, the teacher training programs that we see in the countries that we work are not really guided by evidence. And what they do is things that we already know that they don't work, like, a cascade training, not linking training with incentives, doing trainings on theoretical concepts rather than what they can use in the classroom the next day. And one part of the problem is that in order to be able to improve those teacher training programs, you need to know what the teachers are doing. So to identify the weaknesses and strengths and improve it. And why do we think that classroom observation tools is a tool can bridge that gap, can be able to identify teachers' strengths and weaknesses? And why don't we, one could say that you have a student assessment, you also have teacher assessments, that may be enough. And what we said is, there is a piece of research by Strong and others. They did an experiment, and they classify teachers. They have value-added score, so they have teachers that were effective and ineffective using value-added data, and they have the videos of the teachers. So they show these videos to principal and teachers, experienced principal and experienced teachers, and ask them to classify between effective and ineffective. And what they found was that the principals, even experienced principals and experienced teachers, basically classify them in a proportion that was lower than 50%. So basically they were as good as random. And I think this bit of research, as well as others, really point to the issue that it's not easy to know, whether a teacher is doing a good job in the classroom or not. It's not that, I think sometimes people do think that, any of us can just enter into a classroom and figure out what is going on, what is wrong, and how to fix it. And I think what the research is telling us is that that's not easy. And actually having tools to systematically collect evidence on this is important, is sort of the step zero of improving teacher practices in the classroom. So the first question that we had was, which countries measure classroom practices, no? And what we did for this was first look at what we can. We are part of the bank, have a lot of TTLs, and we have an active portfolio, like 144 active portfolios, which encompass 80 countries. So what we said is, we don't really know this information. We've been asking a lot of people, and they may or may not know. So we ask, we Google online, then we ask TTLs, then we ask TTLs through their managers, then we offer pizza, and that's how we collect all this data. So first, thanks everyone that send the data, and a lot of people that have sent the data are here. So we really are very thankful for all of you. But one thing that we found, and this is focused on primary education only, so there were other tools that we received from ECD. So for some countries, we received like 7 tools, for some other countries, 0. And of course, even for a country that you received 7 tools, maybe they were for different states or for different provinces. But what we think out of what we receive, and we talk with TTLs and people working in different countries, is that while there are some tools in different countries, there are very, very, very few countries that collect this data systematically. And by systematically, I mean they've been using the same tool for over 10 years. They use it in some way, and we are being very broad in how they use it and what they do with this data. But we find out that it's actually the case that we have tools for a country that use it 1 year and have some data on that, but they never use it again, or use it in one state. Or, there are a lot of countries where they just develop one. So they just develop one, they have this new tool, they have never tried. It's difficult to foresee whether they will really use it or not. But as I said, we've been very generous also because if not, we wouldn't have something to show you guys. But in very generous in collecting all this data and saying that, we got tools from 30 countries. But if one would actually say which one of those 30 countries systematically collects data on classroom practices, the number would be very, very low. I think that that's also a question for you, and we would be very curious to see what you guys think about it, whether that rings true to your work or not, and because of course part of this is that we're asking people that have a full-time job to get us more information when it's hard, because you have to, we are conducting the policy dialogue, asking them more things. It's not easy, but my perception, and again it's a perception, is that while there is a cost to asking that, if I am as a TTL really know that there is a tool that is used systematically, it wouldn't be so hard for me to either tell you which tool or put you in contact with the right person. The fact that it's so hard to get that information, I think points to the issue that maybe there is that data is not really collected or is not collected systematically. So what we said is that, okay, we got it for 30 countries. Let's assume that if we have done a better job, maybe we could collect 10 more. And again, being very generous about what we are coding as, as a country using a tool when sometimes it was short. So we said that about 50%, and this is a guess estimate, no? So don't hold us accountable. The rest of the presentation will be more rigorous than this. But from the 80 countries that we have, I think it's actually pretty generous to say that half of them do have classroom observations, which they use to measure classroom practices.
This application, so if a country has an inspection function, and inspectors kind of have a rubric that they're supposed to use, that qualifies?
That will qualify, yes.
As you said, and it would be something that a government is doing, or
Yeah, if it is like an RCT or like we wouldn't count that.
Okay.
We wouldn't count that. And we got that, and I think Julia is going to talk just in a sec about that. So just to go fast on the agenda, so we will review the samples of the actual data that we collect and we're using, and the paper will try to do three things. First, tell us what the average tool look like. So all of us have kind of a common understanding of what is this average tool. And then, are these tools evidence-based, meaning whether they measure teacher practices linked to improved learning, and what we code of measuring evidence learn, or whether that something is that practice qualified for things that we know improve learning. We will discuss what did we use to qualify something that is evidence-based or not. We will also discuss a lot about how these countries measure these things. Whether they measure them broadly or whether they measure them specifically. And we will let you know what we mean by that. But I think that will be an important part of the presentation because many of these tools are sort of checklists. So did you provide feedback? And one of the problems with that is that if you don't define what feedback is, if you don't put examples of what is feedback and what is not, it's going to be very problematic for somebody to use that tool to code reliably. And the third question that we are going to answer is, are these tools reliable? Do they have a protocol for reliability? And again, we'll discuss exactly how we measure these and what are the results. And now I'll pass it on to Julie.
Great. So speaking of our sample, this is our final sample. We have a total of 39 tools from 30 countries. So again, thank you to everybody who contributed to this. For today's presentation, we're only using 20 of these tools because we're still working on accurately coding and quantifying the tools that are not in English. So we're only using, for now, the English language tools from the sample. And as Ezzy mentioned, we're not using any RCT tools, because as part of this process, we're working towards helping teacher professional development and teacher training, and generally RCTs are not used for that purpose, or are used for a more specific and non-government related purpose.
Sorry, can I ask, so the original 80 countries, so your original sample that you tried to get information from, where are the other 50 countries? So is that the rest of Africa and some are black and some does it cover most?
Yeah, I think it covers.
Where did you, 80 countries isn't all the low middle income countries, but it's a good.
Yeah, so it's 80 countries where we do have active projects. The bank has active projects.
Active education.
Active education project, exactly.
So that's,
it's
don't know exactly what's included in that. Okay.
Yeah, you want to show them, because what jumped out at me is the US, but then
to show what's not.
Yes. And also, I think for the US, they have largely different tools for every state. And we were trying to focus on tools that are used more in the developing country setting, as we think we're doing for teachers well.
Yeah, I mean, we did ask only people working in developing countries. So we know that there are a lot of tools in the US, but we code separately some of the international tools, but we are going to discuss mostly the countries which we work.
So the first question we talked about is, what does the average tool look like? So before answering this question, I will walk you through our coding methodology that we use to quantify the content of these tools, and then start answering sort of what most commonly is measured in these tools. So for our coding methodology, we have areas, elements, and behaviors. So as an example area is instruction. So this would be an overall area which a tool can measure. And example elements in instruction are content understanding and lesson facilitation. So again, these are sort of sub areas within the overall area of instruction. And then within content understanding, we have an example behavior, connections to the real world. So this is the extent to which the teacher makes connections between the content they are teaching and the students' everyday lives or their lives outside of school. And an example behavior for lesson facilitation is teacher flexibility. So this is the degree to which the teacher individualizes or tailors teaching to account for different students' abilities and needs. So we use this framework of areas, elements, and behaviors to quantify the contents of the tool. So we code them on a scale from 0 to 2. We code them as a 0 if the element or area does not at all appear in the tool. We code them as a 1 if the tool contains this element or area, but measures it using a checklist or a yes or no question. We also code it as a 1 if it measures it using a rating scale, but they don't provide any example behaviors or any kind of guidance for the observer on how to place a teacher, say, on a scale from 1 to 4, and how to consistently place similar teachers on this scale as they see different classrooms. And then we code as a 2 if they have example behaviors or a rubric, or specify or define key terms, usually in a rubric, that goes with a rating scale for the element. So the key difference that we want to highlight between the coding of a 1 and coding of a 2 is sort of what Ezzy talked about broad and specific measures. It's the amount of information that is given to the observers to make their coding decision, as well as how much information is collected on the tool, given the way that the question is phrased or that the answers are recorded. So overall, we have a framework of 3 areas: classroom culture, instruction, and socio-emotional skills. Within these 3 areas, we have 30 elements. These are not all pictured on the diagram here, but about half of them are descriptive. So they talk about what the tool measures and how it measures it. And 63 behaviors within these 30 elements. So we're definitely not trying to say that a perfect tool will measure everything that we have here, but we wanted to make sure that we cover everything that a tool could potentially measure so that we can record the contents of everything in our sample using this framework. We developed.
So this is like the superset of things.
Yes.
So this isn't ex ante defined. This is ex post. This is defined ex post based on the actual tools.
Sort of. So we did. We developed the framework before we started coding the tools, and then changed the framework a little bit after we did the first round of coding. So to get to more detail on that, we developed the first step to developing this inventory of areas, elements, and behaviors was we examined international tools. So we looked at a paper written by Jill et al. In 2016 in Mathematica, which examined the content of 5 internationally commonly used international tools and classified them into areas and elements and examined how they're related to teachers' value-added scores. And then we also added other areas and elements from other international tools that Jill et al. Did not include. Then as a second step, there was a working group of 30 TTLs, which narrowed down this very large inventory of areas and elements into a smaller short list, largely by asking 3 questions, which were: what do effective teachers do? Which of those can be recorded using the classroom observation tool? And then which of those are of interest to policymakers? And so then we took that final list, and knowing that this was developed from international tools, we examined our national tool sample, and after reviewing them and looking at them, added a few other elements that were not originally in the short list of indicators. In addition to that, we did 2 rounds of coding, and in between the 2 rounds of coding, we added more elements that we sort of found in the national tools that were not present. So, for example, family engagement was one of these. A lot of tools seem to measure whether teachers include the students' families in the learning process, which was sort of not measured in international tools. The important one was the use of a local language, again, not present in our original inventory, but we added in after the coding. So given all that, we took a look at sort of what were the most common things from our elements that national tools measure and how they measure them. So they largely measure 10 elements, which of course does not mean they have 10 questions, but they measure 10 of our categories that we have defined as elements in some way, shape, or form. This is an example from our sample that meets a lot of the criteria of sort of an average tool, and that it measures a lot of the things that an average tool measures. So these 2 are not on the picture, but largely they start with some data collection. So they look at, for example, how many children are in the classroom, how many boys and girls, how many are absent, and then check something about the classroom environment. Do all the children have textbooks? Does the teacher have something to write with? Then they usually talk about some broad teaching mechanics, for example, or clear presentation, classroom management, and lesson facilitation. So does the teacher outline clear learning objectives? Do they measure time, or do they manage time effectively? Do they manage behavior effectively? And then do they use multiple teaching methods to get their content across? Then they move to more specific pedagogical techniques usually. So check for understanding, content understanding, feedback, and sometimes the social climate. So they check, does the teacher ask the students questions? Do they give them feedback on their answers? Do they give them an opportunity to practice what they have learned? And then sometimes they also check the sort of social environment between the teacher and the students. And at the end, they generally make some notes or recommendations, mark strengths and weaknesses or something like that. And so the average tool does, or the majority of the tools in our sample do record the answers to these questions using yes or no responses or using a checklist of options. So after having looked at sort of what is most commonly measured, we got to the first question, which is, are the tools evidence-based? As you mentioned, we consider tools or elements to be evidence-based if they measure factors that predict student outcomes. So if they're positively correlated with increases in student test scores, if they're positively correlated with increases in teachers' value-added scores, or with another measure of students' learning outcomes. To understand which elements met this criteria, we synthesized evidence from 15 papers, 12 research papers, and 3 systematic reviews published recently. I think the latest one was in 2016 and the earliest was 2005. And these papers synthesized evidence from 10 different countries. We wanted to make sure that we have a broad evidence base for this classification. So we have evidence from 5 countries in Latin America: the US, Ghana, Pakistan, India, and Switzerland. From just the 12 research papers and then the 3 systematic reviews, pull from an even broader field of evidence. So in an effort to avoid miscategorizing any elements, we don't say whether things do or do not predict student outcomes. Instead, we classify them in 3 categories depending on the degree to which they predict student outcomes. We have 3 categories. We have low, mixed, and high. Now, as you can see, that does not add up to 30, but again, a lot of our elements are descriptive, so we did not classify the descriptive elements here. We have 4 elements that are classified as low, which means either no paper mentioned them as having any relationship to student outcomes, or they were only mentioned in papers as having a 0 or negative effect on student outcomes. 4 elements are mixed, which means that either about the same number of papers found a positive relationship and a no or negative relationship, or there was contradictory evidence from the same country. So for example, there was a paper that found a positive relationship between an element and student test scores for high-income students, but not for low-income students. So that we counted as mixed evidence. And 7 elements are high, which means that we consistently found positive relationships between those elements and student outcomes. So we then took these 15 elements that we classified, and we examined, so of these 15 elements, how many do tools measure? And of the ones they measure, how many are low, mixed, and high? So if a tool measures 10 of these 15 elements, how many of the 10 fall in the low category, in the mixed, and in the high category? And the results are quite encouraging. So on average, about 19% of elements in a tool will have a low relationship to student outcomes, 25% will have a mixed, and 56% will have a high relationship to student outcomes. We also wanted to understand the variation in our sample, so we looked at the tool that has the least amount of low elements and the tool that has the most amount of low elements. So the tool that has the least low elements has 17% low and 83% high. And the tool that has the most low has 50% low and 25% mixed, 25% high. So it's quite encouraging to see that over 80% of elements in an average tool have at least a mixed relationship to student outcomes. But sort of coming back to what we talked about specific versus broad measures, we find that although most elements are related to student outcomes, most elements are measured broadly. So these are some examples of elements that measure feedback in our sample. I will show you a 5th example, and then we'll come back to sort of talk about these examples a little bit. This is a 5th example. So this comes from Teach. There are some examples in our sample that are sort of good feedback examples, but because we wanted to make sure to hit every point about what we're trying to make about specific examples, we use Teach. So Teach both defines the key terms and gives examples of what behaviors fall into this low, medium, and high category. Those are sort of the key aspects of a specific measure. But so going back to the simple measures or the broad measures, the sort of key issues we found with these questions are they don't define the terms and they do not give examples. So for example, what counts as feedback? What counts as immediate formative feedback or even written feedback? So if I put a check mark and a cross next to a student's work, does that count in the same weight as if I write a paragraph about what the student did well and what the student could improve on? In the same way about immediate and formative feedback, in this question, a teacher who, say, has the students working on an activity but calls them up one by one to talk about, say, their homework or another assignment, because they don't give immediate feedback but they are formative, will be coded in the same way as a teacher who gives immediate feedback but just says, correct or incorrect. And because from the information from these questions, we cannot tell those two teachers apart, we cannot give them detailed professional development or teacher training guidance to help them improve their teaching. From these questions, we largely cannot tell the differences between teachers like that apart. But looking at our entire sample, so these were feedback elements, on average, about 33% of elements will be measured specifically. So we'll have a definition or some example behaviors or a rubric. These are our 3 areas. And these charts show how many elements or what percent of elements in each area are measured broadly versus specifically. So broadly being these examples we just saw and specifically being more like the example from Teach. As you can see, there's some variation, and interestingly, instruction has the lowest rate of specific, and instruction also happens to be the area that contains the most elements that are most strongly related to student outcomes.
Right. Could you say, can you give a few examples of what the elements are in the high, just so that we can?
Yes, so elements that are in the high include feedback, check for student understanding, so assessments or questions, clear presentation and lesson structure, language development, so use of local language is included there, as well as motivating the classroom. So positive language and communicating high expectations. So
I guess I can see some sort of a trade-off. I mean, it's not clear to me specific always dominates broad in the following sense. If I want to get whether the teacher provides feedback, I could ask that generally. For argument's sake, let's just say that captures well feedback. If I ask a very specific question, does the teacher pull students aside and talks to them for 5 minutes? That's a better measure. It's something that is identifiable, quantifiable probably, but it only captures one very narrow aspect of what providing feedback would be. So I'd have a better measure, I'd have a more accurate measure of a much narrower concept. So, right, I mean, you see what I'm trying to say? So in a sense, the specific is nice, but sometimes actually by being specific, you may miss a bigger picture.
I think one of the issues, because we thought about this, no? But I think one of the issues of that is that the biggest problem of broad is that at the end, it's very difficult to know what you are measuring. Like if in 60 minutes, like, oh, this classroom observation tool, that the teacher provides feedback one and says correct, how you can use that to improve what the teacher is doing versus a 0, and then you have a 1 that is that he really addressed the misconception and now the student understands what it was. So I think in those, when we thought we didn't saw a trade-off in the sense of, well, maybe what it would be better is for you to have, say, 4 questions on feedback. So yes, so you get specific and you get 4 different things that you think would cover everything that you need to cover. So you can then, depending on the answer to this question, come up with, say, an indicator of feedback that would be broad. So you can use it more broadly, but will have this detailed information. I think the trade-off does come in, like, how much information do we want this observer to collect. But I think that there's also, like, another problem with the sort of, does the teacher provide feedback, that is on the reliability side. Now, on whether I can give you that information alone and you can, and we would all code probably things very differently, because some folks would say, oh, correct is not really feedback. And so I think we were thinking on that terms, on the fact that, both in terms of reliability and in terms of, like, how you can use that information later on, being broad would be difficult. Even if it seems that it's easier to collect, I think you are collecting something that you can't use. That's what we thought.
There's also an example from one of our tools that we found interesting and was sort of a question for our coding, which was they ask a series of 4 questions. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but the first one is, does the teacher ask the students questions? And then they have 4 possible responses. The next question is, does the teacher probe the students' answers for responses? And then something along the lines of, does the teacher, use the students' responses in the rest of the lesson? So it's a sort of 4 series of very simple questions, but that together make up a relatively good measure of feedback as a holistic picture. Great. So putting together what we have talked about so far, we mentioned that, or estimating that about 50% of countries will be using a tool, will be, at least systematically using a tool in primary school classrooms. Of those, in those tools, about 80% of elements will have at least a mixed or high relationship to student outcomes. And then of all those elements, about 33%, or a third, will be measured specifically as opposed to broadly, which leaves us with most elements having a higher mixed relationship to student outcomes, but being measured broadly, and only 13% of elements being measured, having a high relationship to student outcomes and measured specifically, and 7 and 3% for the low measures. So our last sort of layer of consideration is reliability. When talking about reliability, we ask ourselves a bunch of questions, largely about, do the observers need training before using the tool? What does that training entail? How long is it? Do they use master-coded footage from classrooms to provide the training? Do they have to pass any exam? Is there any reliability check? Is there any minimum threshold which they need to pass? And so we sorted these jumble of questions into 4 distinct questions, which we sent out to TTLs again. So again, we were very grateful to everybody who managed to get us this information, because we know this was a lot of hard work on the TTL side. So the 4 questions were: do the observers need training to use this tool? And if so, how long is the training? Did the government or any other implementing agency ever calculate observer reliability? And specifically, we asked about inter-rater reliability. Do we have any evidence of this process, how they calculated inter-rater reliability? And then, is there any kind of certification exam that observers need to pass in order to be allowed or be able to use this observation tool in observations? We had a 56% response rate from the TTLs. So for the 20 tools that we are presenting today, we have 11 responses. We quantified the answers to these 4 questions into 4 dummy variables and created an index of reliability, which is the sum of these 4. So this shows the index of reliability. As you can see, every single one of the tools which we have information for has at least one of the 4 elements of reliability, but by the time we get to all 4, there's only 1 tool of the 11 left. The most common measure of reliability is training. Or actually every single tool we have heard from so far requires some form of training, and this ranges from a few hours to 2 weeks. The second most common is observer reliability. 7 of these tools have had their observer reliability calculated somehow. 6 of them were in collaboration with either the World Bank or another major implementing agency. And we can access documentation of this for 3 of those 7 tools. And then lastly, only 1 of these tools requires something that is along the lines of a certification exam with, which essentially means minimum reliability thresholds that observers need to pass. So again, that leaves us with 1 of 11 tools, which is 9%, that we are confident is going to be reliable.
Do you know which one that
We do know which one that is.
We've got special pizza.
I don't know if we're revealing. Are we really?
I mean, I think if nobody tells anything, I mean, no, because we got the information from the TTL, so we want to make sure that we let them know to them before we make any of the data public. But we can say that it is in East Asia, but we're not covering which one.
And it's not teach, right?
No.
No, we just use teach as one example. It's not included in the rest of this analysis. But sort of adding this layer, this final layer onto our previous tree, we said 80% of elements are likely to have a high relationship or mixed relationship to student outcomes. 33% measured specifically, and 9% are also, in addition to that, likely to be reliable.
So you mean 1, right? So that's the same one that you had before.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
when you say 50% is 15, and then 80% is 80% of 15 cases.
yeah, so this is technically not in terms of the number of tools, versus
Okay.
rather in terms of the percent of elements within a
Oh,
tool.
got it.
But we also, think that it is reflective of in a larger sample of tools of the percent of.
Okay, got it.
We do also have this tree analysis for the number of tools, but for that you have to set a threshold. So for that we say which tools have at least 75%. But unsurprisingly, that only leaves us with 1.2% of any element in a given tool that is likely to meet all of the criteria that we have laid out. Even if you think that tools that meet 2 of our 4 reliability criteria are reliable, that still only leaves us with 8.4% of elements that are reliable. And again, if every country has a tool, that's still only 2.4% of elements within tools that meet all of this criteria. So with that note, I will pass back to Ezzy for the takeaways.
The recap, I don't need to say much. So as we said, our best estimate of how many tools do have a classroom observation tool that they use systematically is about half. We acknowledge that we probably need to do a bit more research to find out whether that half is correct or not, and to the extent to which these countries do have and use in the past or in the future. I think the biggest, the most important part of the presentation is the second one, the 36.8. So these are, most of them are evidence-based, but they have broad measures, and these broad measures are problematic in at least two ways. One is the fact that it is going to be very difficult to know what is included and what is not included in those, because we don't have examples, we don't have any way to assure that observers will understand. And the second thing is, like, it's going to be very hard to know the quality of what we are measuring. You know, as I was saying on feedback, you know, something that of great quality would be lumped into something of pretty low quality, and that would make us difficult to be used for policy. So, like our urgent call for action. So teach, I think I already did a bit of advertisement, but I won't keep on doing advertisement today. We will do an information session. At some point we will present all the data and all that. So I will stop on that. But I think something like to think about, no? And I don't think this is this is super clear that this is what came out of the analysis, but it's like, in the 50s, when they started thinking about the student assessment, they built the IEA and PISA and started collecting information. And those were used as benchmark, no? Because there was not only the fact that they were collecting information across countries, but it was also the case that they provide a lot of knowledge and a lot of public goods on like how you measure this, what is the best way to do it. And even at that point, a lot of people say like, oh, well, but they do have different curriculums, so how you do that? And they were able to show that even with different curriculums, even with different countries that teach very differently across, you can still do something like that. And that can be something that could be used to improve what countries do now. And I think for classroom practices, there is nothing like that. I think the closest to that is class. And class, you have to pay. They don't care about the other countries. They don't care about the countries that are not the U.S. because they do have their own market. But the way that they conduct the business is not as if it was a research entity trying to provide public goods, because that's not the way they get their money. So we thought that, okay, why have nobody thought about this? And probably you would have good ideas why this would be a bad idea, but we would be happy to hear those. But this would be more in terms of like, getting awareness of classroom practices through measured, standardized way across countries. And that's one way to do it. The other way that we thought that this could be done is to think about how we can embed this better in the professional development programs that we have. And I think as part of the work that Geek is doing with the global leads will be to try to think about, we will develop Teach, we have a tool that we are still validating in the process of working with blah, but then how can we make sure that we develop other public goods that could be used for countries to either adapt the classroom observation tool that they have or use what we provide, but use it in a way that improves their teacher training program. Either creating a video library using this or learning, for example, if I have feedback of one of my elements, okay, now you measure whether the teacher is providing feedback and sort of the quality of the feedback he's providing. Can you tell that teacher to improve upon that feedback? Or if the teacher is not, when he checks for understanding, he asks, oh, who knows this? And, a student raise their hand. Are there better ways? Are there better techniques that we can teach those teachers? And can we use a tool to monitor the progress? And I think that is sort of something that we hope, it's done more broadly, and we're going to start doing from our side. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to Huma, I just wanted to say at the outset, something that was I didn't say but was so obvious to me. I want to thank Izzy because he's both playing the role of a leader and a practitioner on this work on a lot of different fronts, and we're lucky to have somebody with this dedication in these dual roles. So let's go to the comments and then we'll go to questions. Huma?
I would like to begin by thanking Ezzy, Giuliano, and Michael for organizing this BBL and giving me the opportunity to come up with some discussion points. Our presenters have already summarized the findings, so I will straight to the discussion points. And I have 3 areas of reflection that I bring up. The first has to do with deep acknowledgement of this work. I have been quite excited ever since we started receiving emails to help compile information, examples of classroom observation tools, and on behalf of my colleagues in education field, I would like to thank you for taking this initiative and sharing all that information and moving one step ahead and actually developing the tools that each module and piloting that session. It cannot be emphasized enough how important it is for us to understand and deconstruct classroom practices in both their intended and unintended forms. What's happening inside the classrooms is perhaps closest to explaining why a child performs the way he or she does. And as we see from the presentation, the measurement efforts are quite scattered, they're varied in comprehensiveness, they fare quite poorly on reliability and evidence base, and it is a matter of great concern. And we're already pretty late in entering this area of work, so I completely commend the team for furthering this research. And over the coming months, I look forward to more sessions and trainings on each module and on how we can incorporate that in our ongoing work. The second area of comments that I have has more to do with concerns that relate with how observation tools are actually used in the field. How much do they deviate from their original intention? And, or perhaps a better way of phrasing that would be that how many new purposes do they adopt when they are in the field? These checklists could be used as prescriptive practices, and maybe there's nothing wrong with that as long as we're careful about that and of its implications. I personally see both pros and cons of that happening, and would encourage greater discussion on how these tools, when they reach the classroom, to the principals, to the teachers, what do they look like, and how do they see that piece of paper or that what it looks like to them. And in that regard, I'll sneak in a few questions here, and I think part of those questions have already been answered. That when you analyze the instruments for the various elements they covered, how much did you factor in for the specific purpose with which they were designed? Were the tools that were designed to measure compliance and provide feedback to teachers any different from tools that were designed for educational research purpose? And I think you've already answered that question, that this study focused more on government administrator tools rather than RCTs. But it would be nice to hear more about maybe a typology of classroom observation tools by their intended purpose, types of implementers, administrators, whether they were done by teachers, principal, inspectors, or third parties, and how does that help us understand different pieces of how these tools are being used and what impact or effect they have in the classroom. Finally, my third piece of reflection pertains to the next phase of this work. Honestly, I tend to be a little skeptical. That's my temperament. Whenever I hear about classroom observations and checklists, my first very reflexive response is that, oh, well, it's a checklist. And what about the context and external factors, scalability, observability, and reliability? Could there be a standardized way of measurement? Should there be one at all? But over time, as that skepticism begins to calm down, I think on greater reflection, I think I can appreciate this work as a phase of inquiry, as a way of introducing evidence into classroom observation practices, as a way of promoting stronger linkages between teacher training, classroom environment, policies, and student outcomes. And I agree that this work is an essential piece in moving forward. Without knowing more about things in how they are in their current state, we'll continue to depend on out of context evidence. But there's a lot to be careful about since we are dealing with scarce resources, time, and but it's like a catch-22 situation that we can be critical of existing measurement efforts, tools for not being sufficiently context sensitive, but unless we push forward with such research, despite its imperfections, we cannot generate that evidence to make tools contextually relevant. So I think it's a courageous undertaking because you will meet a lot of skepticism on the way, but somebody needs to do that, and I thank you for doing it for us. Just one last piece, and I'll then. I read this article last week, somewhere on Facebook. I don't have the reference now, on how knowledge about different cultures is shaking the foundations of psychology. And we know that the academic discipline of psychology was largely developed in North America and Europe, and it continues to inform our understanding of what drives human behavior and mental processes. And what we understand as universal cognitive processes, we are increasingly realizing that a lot of that is rooted in culture and societies. And I think we should be open to questioning the claims of universality often made by cognitive theorists. And I think such measurement, because we are closer to the field, allows us to make that loop back, that we can also contribute to the field of cognitive science by bringing in how the theories work, are effective or not so in the field. And I think I'll end it there. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I'd like to go to a round of questions here, and then we'll check from online. And Lorelei, if I would collect some questions after the first round. So who would like to ask a question? Maybe we'll take 2 or 3. All right.
Sorry, just going back to your thanks first of all for the presentation. Going back to your map, just trying to understand, when you say it's a national tool, so things like where bank projects are working with people like class to do this, are they part of your universe or no?
So I think it depends. I think we have, so in Tajikistan, I think they're using class, and they adapted, and they now is their own tool, so we count it. They send it uncounted. I think the one, when they can't send us the tool because class doesn't allow us, we didn't count it. So, like, for example, I think Kyrgyzstan,
Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. The reason I'm asking is because a lot of the Central Asian, like Ding Yong did a bunch of work with class, and it's part of a project, it's not part of an RCT.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, is that counted as a tool or not in your case?
It would be counted if we got it, but we didn't. So that's the easiest answer.
No, and also in Tajikistan, from what we understood about that tool, thoroughly adapted the class tool for their own context. And so that's why we counted that as a national tool as opposed to the original class tool.
No, but just to clarify, I do think that if we were to get, like, say, for example, is Kyrgyzstan said, like, this is my own tool and now I'm using it, whatever, I think that would be counted. I think, as I said, in that particular case, we didn't get the tool, so we just don't want to code if we can't get it, because we don't know whether there was any adaptation or not, or was exactly the same tool.
Dion, and then we will go Dion, and here, and Toby.
I wanted to double down. I thought it was great comments. I wanted to double down on the one in the middle about the purpose. That relates to what your question. I think you'd want to classify, with the 20 and then with these inspection sheets that someone was supposed to travel around with. Are these forms that are given to principals to oversee schools? Are these a study that was taken that's owned by the government, but that was like a study that was done recently? I think that will help us because again, some of these forms it might just be to jog a person in the classroom's memory, like an inspector who's supposed to visit some classrooms and then talk to a teacher afterwards. And in which case, just a broad, it's really just a memory device for the inspector. It's not really a detailed data collection thing to really map out the areas of strength and weaknesses. It's sort of it's used by an inspector to maybe just guide their own conversations they're having with the teacher afterwards. Others might be really going out collecting data to understand what our teachers are doing and sort of derive policy. So the first one is not really about policy. It's just about it's a crutch for an inspector. Anyway, that's just an example, but I think it'd be useful as a part of your stock taking to understand to what purpose these are actually put. And then I think what you said then, following on from that, how does that then relate to that content? I think it's kind of useful.
Yeah, just going back to your calls to action at the end. So I just want to sort of definitely give my support behind the second one in particular. I think sort of figuring out how to move from the collection to the use in training is incredibly important. But I think it points to kind of a bigger problem around the capacity constraints on who knows pedagogy well and who knows how to teach it in countries, right? So I think we run up against that problem a lot. And then how that links up with our operational and policy dialogues in a lot of countries, right? So I'm just thinking, thinking about it while you were presenting, getting into that level of detail is just not something that we often have the bandwidth for, any incentives to do, especially in projects. And thinking about how to push harder on that front, I think, is really important. I know that obviously links up with the WDR and the messages coming out of that. And then on the first call to action around potentially thinking about an international data collection effort behind it. I also think my initial reaction is quite skeptical in the sense of it makes me think of Lant Pritchett's sort of the way that he describes something like teaching, right? So there's a huge difference between something like if I ask you a question like, were you on time to your first meeting this morning, right? Like there's a sort of measurable, objective answer versus if I ask you, did you have a good morning? Like there are 30 things that we could talk about that go into that, and it's very detailed and rich and so I think he sort of makes that analogy with something like teaching and whether or not it even makes sense to go down the path of trying to come up with sort of an international standardized database. I think would be an interesting thing to talk further about. But yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this work. I think it really throws up a lot of very interesting questions that we need to confront internally as well as within our dialogue. And to pick up two of them, I mean, one just to reinforce Huma's original comment as well on how the tool is used. So just to give you an example, I don't know whether you used something we did in India, but we did a small study in a couple of states in India where we used a tool, and it was meant to give a picture of the way, in the original dialogue with the government, it was meant to give a picture of the type of teaching that you see as a way to open a dialogue about the way that in-service training should be conducted. When the senior civil servant saw the results, and it was, 70% is basically teachers standing at the front and the kids being absolutely quiet, she was, well, what percentage should it be? And we'll make sure every class has that percentage. Now, it's easy, but so the way this tool could be used for a dialogue, and this was sort of my second point to pick up also on your comment, we can use this very effectively, I think, as a way of helping the country think about what it is to be a good teacher, which is, I think, not a conversation really that has happened very often. I mean, they have good teacher awards in many countries, but what is it? I mean, these are pretty facile things, it seems to me, but having a conversation with the Ministry of Education about what good teaching is in your country, how would you know that you've seen it? And particularly since you start from the premise, quite rightly, that what is linked to outcomes, and what do outcomes they know? Well, they know examinations And if the examinations are the rote learning, then probably collaborative project-based learning is not going to help most students do well in the examination. But that's exactly the conversation to have, is how are you measuring student outcomes, and therefore how will you link what is good teaching. So I think this kind of work is very valuable in really pushing us to have that dialogue with our governments and providing some information about how to go about that conversation. But therefore, like was already said, understanding how these different tools might be used differently, I think, is also going to have to be part of that conversation.
If you'd like to respond, and then we have a question from online.
So thanks again for all the questions, because I think, as Uma pointed out, and Dion, and I think a couple of people point out, we are struggling a little bit on like what is the use of these tools. First, because it's not always super clear from when we got the submission, and even after asking the TTL, it's not super clear still what they use it for. And also because we're presenting only 20 tools, we didn't want to like do disaggregate even further. But I do think that knowing the purpose will help understand much better the results. Like for example, I know that many of these tools are part of the checking the implementation of a program. So if they are able to do something related to like teacher training, is better, but that's not their really focus. And as I said, that also comes to the fact that because there are not a lot of countries systematically collecting this data, we sort of accepted those as, this is the closest that we have to a tool being used in this particular country. But doing that analysis, I think, would be helpful, and we hope to do it once we code all of the tools so we have more information. And probably if we send another email to every TTL, we will remind them that this was a suggestion from them.
Dion suggested.
But I will push back a little bit on whether this is a memory device, because, it would be okay for this to be a memory device if you know that inspector really know what he's doing. But when we go and test teachers, we know that they, many of them, lack the teaching abilities that we would hope them to have. So, we haven't done it, but I imagine that if we test these inspectors in the same way that a strong test them on like, can they identify good teachers or not, I think in many cases we are going to find that is as good as random. So I guess will depend on which country. So I see in the US makes a lot of sense. Like if you go to uncommon schools, they don't have a classroom observation tool because they already know, have ingrained in their heart, teach like a champion or whatever thing that they do. So for them, it's easy to figure out whether they are doing these things or not. But in the countries that we do work, I think having a more prescriptive approach, maybe, I think it would make more sense. Because even as we talk about diverse teaching practices, if you look at the tools, they are all measuring the same things all across. So it's not the case that they think that teaching is very different, or at least what you need to get in teaching on these tools. Of course, this is part of the reason because they just see other tools and sort of imitate. But okay, I just said that there is some trade-off as well on how much we want to prescribe or not, depending on which country do we work. And then, I agree with all of you about the skepticism about setting up an international place to measure all these things. I think the point that I was just thinking about is like, we don't think it's so weird in a student assessment, but and we all think that. I think we all would think that PISA and IEA are good for student assessment. Yeah. So, but I don't have a strong point there. So I don't know whether you have any.
Not on that. I've been thinking about. So as soon as you brought up the purpose, I started thinking about our sample, and one of the first things we tried to do was identify the purpose. Like I remember what was one of the first things that I did on this project was try and figure out the purpose of all these tools. And again, without sending more or asking for more information from the TTLs, it was extremely difficult. Even the tools that came in like a school inspection manual or any kind of teacher appraisal manual, didn't clearly outline the purpose of the tool. So there was a few that came in like a big manual, and I tried to read through it to see, are these being used for inspections and that like this might have a consequence for the teacher in their career, or is this just professional development that doesn't necessarily have a consequence, or is it just a school inspection framework that is trying to see what the overall situation is in different types of schools? And it was very difficult to identify. But so it's not that we completely ignored what the purpose of the tools were, but that's kind of something we're still working on. And to a short point about the different purposes, I think the one difference that I noticed throughout was that the tools that were more used for like the implementation of a program, for example, were very specific. So they measured, 2 elements, but they measured them with 100 questions that got down to very minute details of, does the teacher do this minute practice and this minute practice, and how many times do they do this minute practice, which were just sort of an interesting variation on the sort of regular teacher observation tool and had clearly different purpose than most of our sample.
So we have a question from Barbara Bruns, and then I'm going to go to Summer back here, and then I'm going to put myself on the list for a comment. So from Barbara Bruns, I'm very surprised that Chile is not listed. Chile has a very advanced and systematic process for videotaping teachers and evaluating their classroom practice using a clear rubric based on the FFT, Framework for Teaching Instrument. All of those reliability indicators have been met by Peru, Brazil, and Mexico, which use the Stallings classroom snapshot. Why don't you consider the Stallings instrument first basic way to get reliable and comparable data on some key indicators that are correlated with learning in the basic framework? And then there's also mention of Chile's Dos Sigmas teacher evaluation instrument. So we have a question from Barbara on instruments from Latin America. Let's collect a few, and then you can respond.
So just a suggestion. I know getting hold of TTLs and their time is very precious. I mean, you might just want to think about asking them who they got the information from, or who actually organises this, and then to speak to them. I mean, do a phone call. I think Dave did it with the teacher training stuff. I think and just spoke to them, and that you might actually then be able to get exactly the information that you want, because I think it would be really useful to have that. But I just wanted to ask if you could explain a little bit more about the evidence base that you've used to sort of code this up, because I was just thinking about some of these questions, and I mean, I think there's a complete mismatch, if I understood correctly, with the countries that we have here that you survey for these tools and the evidence base, where they're kind of slightly different, developing for the ones that you've selected and developed countries for the evidence base. And I just wondered whether what you've done to sort of think a little bit about how a classroom observation tool in the context of a low-income African country is different, and how the tool would have to reflect that, and whether the evidence base is different. I mean, I'm just thinking, if you've got 100 kids in a classroom, which maybe is a bit even extreme now, you're not going to be providing a huge amount of feedback, and maybe the kind of feedback you provide is not one-to-one feedback. You might be doing something different. So I just wanted to get a sense from you. How you've sort of incorporated that, or if not, sort of what's your feeling about that evidence base that you've used to code it up?
Yeah. So thank you again for this presentation. It was it was just really great to see your work. So for me, everything began like in 1999 with the Teaching Gap book, right? So for me, this whole thing of like looking at the TIMS, looking at these international assessments, and then noticing where we have gaps in achievement, we have gaps in teaching. And then there's this whole video study that happened where we're looking at how teaching is done in China, and we're comparing it to how it's done in the United States. Some of the work that came out of that was really fascinating, at least at University of Michigan, was this instrument, the mathematical quality of instruction. And the reason why so this is why we don't want to, this is why I don't compare MQI to class. So I grew up at University of Michigan my whole life, right? So that's where I was growing up. And what happened for us was, it was clear that mathematical knowledge was affecting the quality of instruction, but it was something specifically about that interaction, right? So this tool was developed, MQI, Mathematical Quality of Instruction, to look at how does that move achievement. It's a very different question from what is good teaching and what does good teaching look like. It's not a pedagogical instrument, and that gets conflated a lot of times. So understanding the purpose around which a tool is created, and even though they could both be linked to student achievement, they're linked to student achievement for very different reasons. One's a function of content knowledge, and one is a function of pedagogy, right? And so then, in as much as those things are different, it's also going to have very different implications around how you use them for professional development, right? So, for me, like coming from that world, the dream, right, is that you can illustrate and demonstrate for teachers through video, what does it look like for content knowledge to really move achievement inside those interactions with students and teachers? What does it look like for pedagogy to really move what's going on in those interactions to impact student achievement? Those are different. There's a bifurcating result about how you use those tools to learn from those tools and learn in and from the work of teaching, and what that means then for what you can build in a teacher training program, what that means that you can do with that tool for professional development. It's just such a boom. That's why so for me, when I was asking the question of pedagogy and we were talking about that here at the bank, I went to class and people were like, why wouldn't you use MQI? Because that's a content knowledge issue. And we're not, so there are different ways in which you'll use tools, and there are different things that you can get out of those. So to go back to the purpose, in my mind, what teach could be, like, and it's very much what you've already described, and it's kind of this resurgence about how video study can lend itself to what it means to learn in and from practice, but from different contexts. So in one context, they may not even know what quality feedback looks like. They may not know that has anything to do with supportive persistence in a student, and they may not know anything about funnel sequencing of questioning. That's really about getting at students' persistence and like grit, as we sometimes call it. If you don't know that, then it'll be hard for you to capture what that looks like in different cultural contexts, to learn in and from that work in different contexts. So I would just say that Teach has the ability, right, to use video to enable this very rich environment around which people can actually support people to learn about things they don't even know yet, in order to develop it in their own practice, which you can't do it until you can see it. And once you see it, you may not still be able to do it, but at least you know it exists. And you might need some scaffolding to support that. So I just think it could be an incredible adventure for you guys, and it sounds like you're on your way. So, I want to say thank you for that.
So I want to add a comment and then go to responses. On the question of prescriptiveness and what you cited as the existing literature about what predicts high student learning, I think my position is that I think we're in a better position. We're better served to think of that as a growing and expanding type of literature where we're uncovering more and more every day, but it's going to be very much an ongoing process, right? And that we learn about what kind of things cluster around, associated with higher learning outcomes, sort of cognitive activation, things that are clarity of understanding, their feedback, right? But it's a long process to understanding why those are associated with higher student achievement. And I think there might be a real benefit from kind of adding in this element of that literature is going to grow, our understanding is going to grow, and as we're getting there. And the second part of that, I think, a little bit I know in nutrition, when you eat a lot of kale and all this good stuff that's recommended, there's this debate about, are you getting a positive from what you're actually eating or what you're substituting by not eating, bad food? And when I think of the learning crisis, I think of a lot of bad practices. And how might this tool also add in the elimination of, what are known to be less effective practices, and not lose the angle of of doing less of the bad, moving more towards these things, even as our understanding, of exactly how those better elements go together. So just a suggestion that a lot of teachers have this tool has the opportunity to point out things to cease doing and things to replace with generally better types of practices, even as our knowledge of the specifics of what exactly leads to learning outcomes grows. So please, responses, thoughts, especially we did have that specific question from Barbara, which I think if you can please address and other things.
So in terms of Chile, we just didn't got the tool. So the answer is we didn't got the tool.
It was from the process because
yes.
Okay.
So I wasn't aware of the tool. So both
okay.
wasn't aware of the tool and we didn't got the tool. So we will contact the TTL.
I'm seeing Barbara tomorrow, and I'm going to ask her to send some specific information on this. So it was not specifically left out. It was because of the way that the TTL.
We didn't got it, but we'll get back to the TTL on that Chile.
And also to add, we're still, so this presentation was only about the English language tools, so we're still coding the foreign language tools because we didn't want to, with the translations, make too quick of a coding of the foreign language tools. So we haven't coded any of the Latin American tools for this presentation.
On summer question on, so we did some phone calls with the person. So if the TTL would contact with the person that ran this, we would call that person and do it. And we asked the TTL whether they could contact with the person sometimes. TTL did not contact. But as I said, we will follow up with that. The problem is that we also, when we don't get 3 times we ask something and we don't get an answer, we also understand that, the person might be doing things that are important as well. I don't really want to answer, so we take a hint. On where they are evidence-based, so there is a mismatch, so we don't have perfectly the same countries, but we do have many of the countries. Now, I think Pakistan, for example, is in both. What you said?
We have 5 Latin American Caribbean countries. So I think the countries India we don't have a tool for in our sample.
But we have evidence on evidence. So the mismatch between the countries that we use to code what is low, mid, and high, mix and high, and what are the actual countries that we have. So I do think there is a mismatch. We did try to get as many developing countries information as possible. Of course, as you notice, it's not Vietnam is a developing country, Tanzania as well, and they are very different. Though I still would say that some of these things, so for example, classroom management is something that in the US it's always high, and because in many developing countries that doesn't seem to be an issue related to student outcomes. It's on the mix because we find a lot of papers that are not. So I think on that and you see, when you see videos of Pakistan, Afghanistan, you see that the kids behave very well, and that's not correlated at all with good teaching practice on the part of the teacher. And I'm trying to think in the case of Tanzania, you have this big crowd. I think you still do have to do check for understanding. So I think what you would do it differently, So some of these things is that you will try to get at the same things, but differently. If you are checking for understanding, you are not going to ask every student, but you may do a question and ask, how many of you think it's option A? How many of you think it's option B? And even with 100 students, now you can know whether they know it or not. But we did thought about what we could do to sort of close that gap. But if you have any ideas or a paper in Tanzania that you want to send us, we will be happy to add it to the list.
And so just to add on that, that's sort of why we decided to use a mixed category, because interestingly, so things that are in the mixed category include critical thinking, student focus, so the things that are more group work based or social skills based or more sort of advanced thinking based are in the mixed, exactly because generally evidence from more developed countries shows them to be very important. but from more developing countries show them to be less important because they're focusing more on, or they need more feedback or more simple things like feedback and check for understanding. And if you're trying to do too advanced things before the students can read, then it's not very good pedagogical practice, at least according to the evidence. So sort of that's how we kind of incorporated the mix of evidence that we have. Is a lot of them go into the mixed category because there's some positive evidence, some negative evidence.
Yeah, and I think as what Michael was saying, that we really are learning on this area. We don't think that this may change as we have more papers on how we code these things.
I was looking at some stuff yesterday about the same practices creating different outcomes in math and science. Right? And so you add in the discipline, and it's. But I think that, generally, right, like the increase in knowledge is first of all, this is a great sense of further opening up understanding at a much more granular level as the research is advancing, knowledge of what's happening in the classroom is advancing. Lorelai, do we have any other questions from online? No? Any other questions in the room?
Just one small just comment really rather than a question. Just when you think about how the tool is used, one of the things it may be in the rubric or just you can get this information is the extent to which an overall score is given or whether somehow it's the individual answers that matter, because that will obviously affect the way you give feedback. So if you want to give feedback about classroom management, then you need to look at the classroom management score. But if it's going to be used for appraisal, it may be that an overall number is produced somehow from the individual answers, and that might give you some clue about the way it's going to be used. If there's some explanation of how you go from 43 answers to something else.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Just one other thing. So when you were talking about, like, in some contexts, content understanding or these other pedagogical domains, you're not necessarily seeing that having a relationship to student achievement, I would just caution, because, like, for example, with mathematical quality of instruction, we could find a lot more variation, say, in China or a different country in East Asia than we do in the United States. Then we would say, well, MQI isn't really showing that in the United States context, but we know that that's not true. We just know it's a result of lack of variation, so we're having like a floor effect. So I would just caution against being too led by the data.
So, thank you very much, and we look forward to